Welcome to the first in our 2020 series of Food Thinkers, Women Food Thinkers, around big ideas from women about redesigning food systems. It's great to have you here, and great to have lots of women here and also lots of guys. So welcome to everyone. And welcome also to the big audience that we have listening online and who will listen later. So this is being recorded, and it will be available afterwards, just to make you aware of that. Now, the purpose of these seminars is for you to come and listen and learn and think, reflect, and then share your thoughts after the main presentation. So that's the most important thing. As part of that, if you do have things you want to share on social media, please feel free to do so. And there's, if you are going to do that, if you could use the hashtag and the Twitter handle, that would be fantastic. Thank you. And Women Food Thinkers for 2020 around big ideas in to redesign food systems. What does that mean? Well, big ideas don't necessarily have to be about things that appear to be big. They're ideas that provide important in-depth insights which can help us figure out how to redesign food systems. So I think it's Davos going at the moment. Having been there myself, I know there's going to be lots of fantastic big ideas being talked about at that event. What we want to focus on at the Centre for Food Policy and in this series is uncovering some of the things that appear quite small through really deep engagement and understanding of the food system, all aspects of the food system, and then to put that in the context of what that means and what we can learn from that for redesigning food systems. So I'm really delighted to have with us for the inaugural Women Food Thinkers, Professor Lisa Jack, because what Professor Jack does is to try and understand what is hidden under the radar about the everyday practices embedded in our food supply chains. The things that we might make assumptions about, but we don't really understand. But unless we understand those practices, we won't understand how to change them. And that applies to the conventional food system, and there are lots of learning from the alternative food system as well. But we must understand that about how the conventional supply chains really do work by understanding those practices to bring them to light. So Professor Lisa Jack, welcome. She is the only professor I know who's a professor of accounting. She's at the Portsmouth Business School at the University of Portsmouth, who studies agri-food industry. There may be a couple of others as well, which makes her particularly special. She's also president of the British Accounting and Finance Association and works with colleagues at the University and the City of Portsmouth on sustainability issues. And she's written some great articles on this issue, as well as some more popular articles and a book on benchmarking food and farming, creating sustainable change. And so she's really a very unique thinker and researcher in this space. So we're absolutely delighted to have you here. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Corinne, and thank you very much for inviting me. And I am actually deeply honoured to be the first person in this series. I was delighted to be asked, and I hadn't quite thought of myself as a food thinker as such, but I guess that's what I am. So, and also the assurance at this point is there is some accounting, but you'll be pleased to know most of my work is qualitative, and there's not many numbers, if that's not your thing. So, I mean, other people might be very disappointed by this. So just a very, very quick bit of background. I've been researching the food industry for the last 20 years. This came about because I got a job as a conventional lecturer in accounting at a former agricultural college, Whittle College. And from there they sponsored me to do my PhD. And by then I'd worked out that there was something very, very peculiar about agricultural accounting, and that's what I did my PhD on. I then followed that up by work on food systems more generally, and in the last 8 or 9 years I've been particularly interested in those companies in the middle, the ones that don't get researched very often. There's a lot of farm research, a lot of retail research, a bit more on catering. There's not quite so much about what goes on in the middle. And it's some of that that I want to bring to the surface today. So the talk's more or less in three parts. The first part is digging into these underlying issues you may or may not know about or may vaguely know about. And my apologies if you're fully conversant, but it's, hopefully you'll enjoy the next section where I talk about, well, what are the problems with alternatives facing food systems? And then I'm going to talk about my, if you like, my grand ideas of what might happen if we really, really want to change the food system that we have. So, I'm going to start. I've been told not to move around. This is quite difficult. My lectures are usually characterised by my wandering around freely, but I've been told to stay here so people can see me. So, apologies if I go out of screen. So, I wanted to start with this quote because when I read this autobiography, which is very good, it's a trilogy, and it's about a young man who comes from London but decides his ambition is to be a farmer, so he goes and takes an apprenticeship at a farm. By this book, he's actually got his own farm. His family decide London isn't so great, so they come to live with him and have this great idea that they're going to supply retail in London. And after a while, this is what he realises, because they're not making any money. So I began to realise how much of the money which the consumer says he gives so plentifully, and the producer says he receives so sparingly, falls through the hole in the middleman's pocket into the gulf of wastage and wear and tear. And that's partly what we're going to be looking at. And this is a quote I use very often. I've updated it from the 1930s. It's a little bit sexist in the 1930s version. So what the consumer doesn't realise is that for the privilege of going out at any moment and buying a chicken ready for the oven, they have to pay for all those times the chicken was waiting for them, and they didn't want it. And that, in a nutshell, sums up quite a lot of the problems with our contemporary food systems, particularly in developed countries, and very much in emerging economies as well. Because one of the interesting things that happened to me was I did a PhD viva about food systems in Saudi Arabia. And something looked very familiar, and of course it's all anonymised. So I asked the question, did they think this up themselves? And they said, no, we got it all from this UK supermarket. So the ideas are going further and further across the world. Anyway, we'll come back to that. Now, this quote I also like has been quite influential to me. It actually came from somebody I interviewed, and a very vehement comment in the middle of the interview. I said, what's the risk if you're a supplier in the middle of the supply chain? The biggest risk is our customers and retailers being promiscuous with suppliers. And the other way around, actually, suppliers being promiscuous with who they sold to. Always chasing the cheapest price or the highest price they could get, depending which way around you get it. Having no longevity, a lot of short-term behaviour. And he also went on to say, and this is in the abstract for this talk, he said, the problem is, in the industry wants the prices you get from trading, but the quality and the service you get from a long-term relationship. And it's some of that I want to dig into. What does that actually mean in practice? Because what I'm going to suggest is that some of the practices that are in place actually create quite a lot of inertia. It makes change very difficult in the system. So some of what I'm talking about is from research I've done and published. Some of the work on alternatives is research I've done but not yet published. And this is a very timely invitation because it's all leading up to a book I would like to write. Okay. So I'm going to go back and try and sort of set up the problem. This is the only set of accounts in the whole thing. And it comes from a fascinating book, and if you don't know it, you really need to get hold of it. It's free online. It's called The Food of London by George Dodd, and it was written in 1856. He was a journalist, and basically he tells you everything you ever needed to know about how people bought, sold, and obtained food in the 19th century. It's fascinating. And in the middle of this, he actually does a bit of accounting. He works out what the producer actually gets when you buy and sell tea. So, tea in 1856 would cost you 54 pence per pound. Don't worry about the shillings, pounds and pence, we'll just stick with it. You may be surprised to know there was a 50% equivalent of VAT on tea at that time. So, okay, so the next person down the chain could only really get that. But they made a reasonable profit to cover their expertise and all the trouble they'd been to. Then there's all these things coming off. Okay, then we get down to the wholesaler, the guy that actually brought it across from China. Okay, they obviously want to make a profit, and then it goes shipside. And then he doesn't actually tell you the next set of costs, but he says that the producer actually only gets 1 penny out of that 54 pence. And they've got to try and grow it for, I should do that one, shouldn't I? 11. That would make a bit more sense than doing that one too. That's the cost they have to try and hit. You might think, well, and you should think, 1 pence isn't very much. Now, the fascinating thing is, I've done a lot of analysis of lots of different types of accounts. That's about the margin you get now. Although the prices and the things have changed in between, that is pretty much the same structure now as it was in the 19th century. I also like this picture because it's people going for the coffee with their own reusable cup. And I looked at this a bit more. I then did something very similar for olive oil based on some very reputable figures that I had. And essentially, yeah, about 60% of that doesn't go to the producer. The producer has a target cost. And I'll try and draw this, but if you can imagine that's about the bottom line, that's what you have to make it for. You'll not be surprised to know, because you keep an eye on the news, that most people, the cost is a bit more. And the reason I use this is because olive oil is one of the most defrauded food types, and it tells you very quickly why corn oil with green colouring in it might be a more profitable enterprise than actually extra virgin olive oil, or even extra virgin olive oil that's actually been 3 times round the mill, but that's not what they're telling you. Now, it's not prevalent in all the industry, but it does happen. So this is quite an important point, that it's very tight, and it's actually quite difficult for producers to meet these target costs. But it's not just the producers that are working on these very tight margins. Everybody is. You just have to stick. The next 5 minutes, you have to stick with me. Okay? You can relax a bit after the next 5 minutes. Okay. This is my theory. Spent ages trying to find a visual for this. The food industry and all the costs that go into it and all the margins that people have to make are a bit like a barcode. Some of the very thin lines are what people actually manage to take out to live on, or as profit. The very thick lines are possibly all the different costs that go in. So I thought maybe this is a bit crowded, but then I thought about it, no, there's a lot of costs in the industry. It really does look like a barcode, a little bit. So what I'm going to talk about is this concept of margins and costs. And when I'm thinking about this in the work that I'm doing at the moment, I'm thinking about, I'm thinking about all these things down here, that there's, yes, there's money margins, but it's also about who has resources. It's also about risk, power, inequality, space and time. But we don't have time for all of that today, so I'm just going to be talking about money and waste. Because I think the food industry can be characterized by having very, very narrow margins for some things, like profit, or even just the surplus you need to keep an enterprise going, and very, very wide margins for things like waste or shelf life. And somewhere, I'm going to argue, we need to find a bit more of a balance between the two. So, let's start with, everybody goes for the supermarkets, but they're actually quite a good place to start. And I've read recently this very interesting book called Supermarketing, written in 1960. It's the only person who's really written about the maths behind supermarkets. The interesting thing is, I've spoken to a lot of people in retail and read a lot of recent stuff, more recent than 1960. This is still how you make a profit in a supermarket. It hasn't actually fundamentally changed. You may do some different things to get there, but fundamentally how you run a supermarket hasn't changed. By 1950, 1960, they'd worked out how to make a profit doing this. So you have to sell at volume, because food just doesn't sell at large profit margins. You might think they're charging a lot for you, but on the whole, no. You have to include non-food lines, encourage people to buy more convenience foods and impulse buying. In fact, Charvet actually says the reason you'll make a profit is because you get people to buy things they don't want to buy when they come in, or at least hadn't got on their shopping list when they came in. You've got to diversify, provide variety, give service and comfort. And this is the bit that most people I speak to haven't realised. A supermarket is not a grocer, is not a store, even though that might be what they're called. They are markets. They know how to merchandise goods. They are selling their expertise in merchandising. They're not selling it to the consumer, they're selling that expertise to the supplier. And they charge them for it. So there is a large amount of, I say large, I should be very careful with my words. There is a stream of income in supermarkets called variously suppliers agreements, commercial income, or other titles. Because they're in the business of providing a marketplace, but most of us think they're in the business of selling goods to us directly. So supermarketing is actually, you have to understand food supply chains, you have to think about them perhaps in a slightly different way. They are an intermediary, but they are also obviously a profit-making business. So I'm going to come back to that. Just hold that in your mind, because that's one thing we're coming back to. And this is another thing you find very often, is you need to get at least one extra person through the door. You might keep them for life, and that's a valuable revenue stream. Conversely, you don't want to lose anybody. And it's all very marginal. A few people can make a difference to the profits. And before I get on to that, we're back again. That 1 pence in 54 was about 2%. And it was 2% in 1960. And the ones I looked at last week were between 1 and 2.5%. Some things really haven't changed. What we're looking at is something that's really very embedded. It's not embedded recently, it's embedded for a long time. So I just thought, let's see what some of these overheads are that are going on in the middle here. I started making a list. And you've got to remember that nearly everything has a cost in the system, so waste has a cost. One of the projects we're doing at the moment is looking at how much it costs you to give away waste, how much it costs you to give away surplus food. Things that you think ought to be free transactions turn out to have a cost to them. Ask me about it later if that's something you want to pick up on. But there's technology and transportation, and technology gets a larger and larger. That band of technology is probably the broadest one in there. People, training, compliance, assurance. There's this whole raft of costs in running the food system, particularly if you want safe food, and you want food of a certain standard, and you want it packaged in certain ways, and you want it to last. None of these things actually come free. So it gets a bit more upbeat later on. Okay, so this is my attempt to draw out some of the problems. Now, again, stick with me. This is, I'm going to explain revenues and costs and profits using this diagram. Now, obviously, you have to think of this a bit proportionally, because if I made it the size where the revenues were proportional to each other, my graph would look something like this, and it would be a bit difficult to explain. So proportionally, this is where the income. So we've got an amalgam of supermarkets, a typical UK supermarket. We've got a big food processing company that might happen to sell quite a lot of fizzy drinks, and it's not Pepsi, but it sells a lot of snack foods. I will say that very quickly, it's not Pepsi. But it's typical of what you might call big food, or what I know somebody else calls a big snack corporation. I've got a medium supplier. These are the people who do a lot of the growing, packing and distribution. So it could be eggs, fruit and vegetables, and a lot of my work is around that fruit and vegetable area. And then we've got the farmer or the producer at the bottom there. But in order that I can actually explain this, we're going to go back to the disproportionate graph. Right. This peachy colour down the side is income. So this supermarket actually doesn't just sell food. So this is its income from other activities, fuel and general merchandise and clothing or whatever. The deep peachy colour is all the money it gets from selling food. Now, I'll come back to the green one. And it's much the same. The corporation and the medium supplier really just do one thing. They process food or they distribute it, so their income all comes from one stream. On the farm, there's some subsidy, there's some income from diversification into tourism or manufacture, and there's the income. Now, you'll remember back on my slide from the producer, he said the cancer of the industry is marginal costing. This is my attempt. I should follow this. Okay. This pale yellow are what are called variable costs. So a marginal cost is, or gross margin cost, is your profit after you've taken off all the costs of sales, all the costs of making or selling or producing. Not all the overheads, but just the costs of doing that business, less the overheads. Okay? And you can see that it's variable, and the farmer has less. Now you think, okay, why is that? Now here's an interesting thing. When you look at the supermarket accounts, the public accounts, and you look what goes into here, they have things like store costs and marketing and electricity that any first-year accounting student would say, but I thought that was an overhead. Okay? So they say all the costs of sales are all the costs of having the stores as well. Any cost of running a store, whether it's fixed or, depends on the volume of sales. Big corporations in their public accounts tend to split it out a bit more. There's research and development, there's distribution, admin costs. So in fact, they've said that far more of their costs are due to overheads. So they've got a different split. And before you say to me, I thought accounting was very rigid, no, it's not. It depends on how you interpret each term in it. I'll just explain this because that's not the important point. Medium supplier, a lot more variable cost. Farm accounts, they tend to be very precise, at least the people doing them. They tend to be very honest about what goes in. They tend to be very conservative about what goes into a cost of sales and what is an overhead. And remember, those overheads are all those bars, you see. Why is this important? It's important because this is how you negotiate the price that you're going to pay in the industry. You negotiate on gross margin most of the time. But the supermarkets are going to make sure they cover as much as they possibly can, and they're going to make sure they cover as little as possible of everybody else's overheads, to put it one way. And this is actually, I'm not saying this in a pejorative way, I'm just saying that's how there's a level of unfairness, and I also think it's not always understood even in the industry itself. So I'm not actually knocking the supermarkets here, I'm just telling you this happens. And one of the biggest problems for producers and suppliers in the middle is that they find it very hard to bring the overheads into any conversation that they have about the price they should get from somebody further up the chain. In fact, we were told by several people that we interviewed, you can't put overheads on the table. It has to be a really stupid price for you to bring it in. And you may remember 2 or 3 years ago, there was a bit of a storm in a teacup in the media because Nestle or Unilever, one of the two, asked one of the big supermarkets to, because of the changes in fuel prices and changes of overheads, they said they needed to increase the price. And the supermarket refused, and there was quite a war went on between them. And that was quite a big issue, because if Unilever or a company similar to them cannot negotiate on overheads, then neither can anybody else further down the chain. But the supermarket still wants to cover this because they have to, and you'll see why in a minute. So one of the things that goes on is that you will try and move cost as far down the chain as you can. And you will also, if somebody makes a saving down here, then people they are negotiating with will reduce the price. So you're sort of chasing this problem the whole time. Now, it's a game. People know what's going on. So if you take a more economist approach to this, you say it's a win-lose game. You know what you've got yourself into if you take part. You can still make a profit and survive and thrive in the industry. But you have to understand that there is this conversation going on all the time that tries to exclude out your overheads. Now, you can make some things as long as you can let somebody have something at that price, as long as somebody else is covering the overheads. And the problem is, most of the time you're just juggling cash flow in order to make up for the fact that you never fully cover the costs of food, because as you can see, there's a lot of them. There's a lot of overheads. So how do you make then a profit? Because what might surprise you is that out of that 30 billion, that orange line down the bottom is the profit. It's very, very small margin. And this is an amalgam, remember, of several places. What's more worrying is that this is the income from suppliers. And if you've got very sharp eyes, you will see that the income from suppliers is slightly more than the profit from everything else. If you don't have that supplier's income, then it can be difficult to survive. Now, there are supermarkets that don't use commercial income, but they're few and far between. But it does beg the question on how you survive in the industry. There are also allegations that some of the commercial income is taken unfairly, but I think that's come to the surface in the UK, and I have noticed over the last 3 years that supermarkets are now saying they only charge 2 or 3 types of supplier income, rather than the 24 or 25 that might have been common 10 or so years ago. So it came to the surface because of the Tesco scandal. Now, that was shown in court not to be a fraud, but it was a manipulation of this commercial income, because it's very tight. And if you've got buyers and others, then yes, you're going to try and want to get that additional supplier's income as well as get a good price. So there's a lot of juggling around the margins here. You get more if you're a big corporation, because there's just more profit on processing food. You'll notice there's no orange line on the farmer, there's just this grey one. That's farm income. That's the income that's left. But if you actually were to put against that the salary or wages the farmer ought to get for the work they've done, that practically wipes it out. So that is in farm accounts as the imputed wages or salary of the farmer. So what we've got is a very complicated, it's not too complicated when you get into it, but what you actually have to understand is there's this fighting for margins going on all the time. And if we extend that idea to, say, consumers even, and you think, well, the people who are hardest hit when it comes to food or in food poverty actually have very high overheads for their income. They have to pay rent, they have to pay travel, there may be other costs, fuel. There isn't much left. What you juggle with is that margin. And it only takes a little more income, and actually you can spend more on food. Similarly, at the other end, if you've got quite a good income and your overheads are covered, then you've got more disposable income. But if I could go through this with virtually everybody in the supply chain, whether you're a consultant trying to make a business, whether you're a charitable enterprise or an alternative industry, you're always working with budgets. You're always hitting that there's only so much you can do. Even if it's not in physical money terms, there seems to be, again, this characteristic of a lot of need, but very little resource. Now, it all keeps working, it keeps going. We're not happy with necessarily how it goes, but it keeps working at the moment. Our worry, of course, is how sustainable it is and whether it can keep going. And I wanted to pick up on one other point, because what I usually get said is that all this money goes to the shareholders. All this money, all this orange line. Well, about half of it does, because you can't afford to give away all your profit, otherwise you have nothing to manage the business with. And you say, well, okay, who are these people benefiting from these large sums of money? And in fact, I can tell you that this amount of money is less than you would have seen on the side of a bus during the Brexit campaign. Now, let's think about it. If you actually want to influence the company you've got shares in, you have to have at least 5% of the shareholding, because in company law in the UK, you need 5% of the shareholding to bring an action against the company. That's okay. Okay. I'm just surprised to know that actually in most food businesses, there are only possibly 2 or 3 shareholders that actually own more than 5%. I was quite surprised when I looked at Nestle. Nobody owns more than 1% of the shares. No one group. Now, this was a bit of a surprise to me, because I have to keep looking this up, because it's changed over the 20 years I've been teaching. Now, the next thing, what's the surprise? Who owns these shares? Is it individuals? Well, actually, in a lot of cases, no. They're asset management companies or investment companies. Because Sainsbury's is, for example, is, and this is on this on the website, has 2 major influential shareholders, and they're both asset management companies. Now, if you're talking about asset management companies, if you then go and look at their shareholders, they're largely other asset management companies. By the time anybody gets a share of this dividend, I've worked out, actually, well, 97% of the shareholders together hold less than 5% of the shares. And if the asset management, okay, it's a large amount of money, but it's still pocket money to an asset management company, nobody's getting a vast amount of money. So why should anybody think that the shareholders are going to change the industry? Nobody's getting very much, relatively very much at all. Nobody owns enough to be able to bring a vote against the company. But they are interested in the profit. Now, obviously, the big difference is the share value is another question. The share value is actually quite good, because a food company can bring in a steady rate of return. But when you get down to our medium-sized suppliers and our farmers, you find they haven't got capital investment. In fact, they've got a lot of loan income, and they've got a lot of the owner's own income reinvested in the company. So we're dealing with something, again, where people are juggling around with quite small amounts of money. But we would have thought, actually, there's a lot of, surely. Now, there are a couple of companies that are different. They have got family shareholders, family trust shareholders, but none of them have more than 50% of the shares. The rest are owned by, guess who? I said, well, yeah. And this is actually a change in the last 5 or 10 years, and it's actually something I'd like to dig into a little bit more about the effect it's had, because before that, I would have told you 10 years ago, well, it's insurance companies and pension companies, and 20, 30 years ago, I'd have said it was individuals. So there's been a change in the market. We'll come back to that, because I realise. So I've been desperately trying to find a picture of the food industry. So I decided it's a bit like a kaleidoscope, because a kaleidoscope's got lots and lots of bits in it, and if you just give it a slight twist, then the pattern changes. Well, the food industry is like lots of people all trying to survive and make it work and huge amounts of good intentions. And I have to say, I really have to keep saying that some of these big companies, if you just took them as companies, are well-run companies, just on that basis, not on any other, leaving aside whatever else you might think about the environment or anything else. But, you know, the point is, though, you twist it every second, and it keeps changing. And it's like that in the food industry. Accounting is quite interesting because it's like it threads together people, and you can see. But food chain gives this idea there's something quite stable in there. But they keep changing all the time. There's not many really long-term stable relationships. You've got this ever-changing picture. And you can do things to make yourself stand out or be more environmental or anything, but essentially you're still trapped within that tube of the kaleidoscope. The system's still the same. So it's not a perfect image, but it begins to give us the idea that we've got an awful lot of pieces changing very rapidly. What is the problem with alternatives? I've been looking at a number of alternative enterprises and alternative groups in the food industry and talking to them. And you still run into the same problems, as you're essentially overheads and margins. Because typically you get some funding, and it may be philanthropic or it may be from venture capitalists, for example. So you get a start-up fund, and it's usually quite generous. And you may start off with the very good intentions of paying your staff better, of giving suppliers a better return, giving producers a better return, which is good. The trouble is you tend to find you can only do that if quite a lot of the enterprises run on voluntary labour, because the costs of actually moving foods around and the costs of storage and of certification and of safety and of technology are still there. So you have to, unfortunately, quite a lot of very good enterprises fold because they spend the money on the technology and the assets, but then there isn't enough to generate a steady flow of cash to keep the enterprise going. Now, there have been successful food hubs and others that do work. There have been successful models, but they've all at some point had to get over exactly the same problems. Just because it's an alternative system doesn't mean you're not going to hit the same problems of margins and overheads. And it's a very, very tight system. So one of the things I'm going to talk about at the end is, well, how can we make that, free that up? How can we make it so that people can actually come up with an alternative without getting trapped into these things? Because it's almost as if these links sort of just hold it all in place. It makes it so difficult to change if it only takes a little bit to knock you over the edge. On the positive side, only takes a little bit to make sure you can survive. And some people do thrive, survive, make quite a lot of money in the industry, but they tend to be the outliers. But the good news is, whilst it takes a little to knock you under, it only takes a little to keep you going as well. So how do you get that balance? But it is locked, because who wants to move first if you're at risk? Who's going to make the change if you're at risk of actually not having any cash in the business? And that's something we need to think about, because it really is part of the inertia in the system. Nobody wants to go. None of the associations that advise farming want to go. None of the charities want to disappear. We certainly don't want individuals to disappear. Okay, that's a problem. So I was still stuck. This wasn't really a good picture. This wasn't the picture I was looking for. So I kept looking around again and saying, well, how can I picture food systems, how they are and how they might be. So I then thought, well, it's more like, I suddenly had this idea, it's like the synapses in the brain linking up. You've seen all those network pictures of the brain making messages across itself. Does that make sense? You know, so I found a paper that actually told me what I was looking for. It's called The Homological Scaffolds of Brain Functional Networks. Fortunately, Wired magazine has translated this paper for us in a useful diagram. Oh, come back. Basically, this is your brain on psychedelic substances. This is your brain acting normally. The way I see the food system, with all its tastes, flavours, excitement, all the possibilities it has, at the moment we're a bit like this. I think we're a lot like this. And it changes, all those pathways keep changing with something new coming in. So trouble, everybody coming in with a new idea. It's just getting into the same system. We actually need to get back to something like this. Now, we also know that planned economies of food have not been very successful in different countries. So that would be the sort of really sleeping state over here. Although if your brain's anything like mine last night, I'm not sure what was going on, but the dreaming certainly meant it wasn't in a sleeping state. Very weird. I think I was dreaming about doing this talk, actually. So we've got this plane. We want to get back to something a little more settled, because I think we're really in quite a mad state at the moment. And it might be great, and this is the interesting thing, isn't it? It might be great fun. But actually, nobody had a long life only living on magic mushrooms. Okay. So we're getting on to, as I realise I've got about 5 or 10 minutes left. This is what I'm thinking around about how do we, not necessarily go into full-scale change, but how could we think about systems differently? What are the what-if questions we should ask? What are the things we should challenge about the food systems as they are now when we begin to understand how food supply, well, works when it comes to money and waste? Well, my particular view, and this was one of my papers I was writing, is about the actual unfairness in the system, is the fact that people who work in it can actually still be receiving poor wages, or they're not getting an income from the food. Now, I do realise some people may just be unlucky or poor farmers, but on the whole, the system should never impoverish anyone. Now, I'm not talking about people already in poverty who need things in the political system and social system to change, such as rents, in order that they have more money to eat. I'm talking for people who actually work in the industry, or as a result of it, should not be impoverished, but they often are. And do you not think it's a bit of an irony that we need cheap food to pay so that people who don't get good wages can buy cheap food, but the people who are giving them the cheap wages are the food industry? Sorry, I haven't said that very well, but there's a bit of an odd thing going on there. But it's quite difficult, as you can see. Now, you can say, but they had all that profit. And I worked out, because I do things like this in my spare time, that even if that supermarket took all their profit for the year, took the profit they could, because they have to retain some, if they took half of it and distributed it amongst their workforce, and doing a very crude calculation that everybody in the workforce was paid equally, so we'll just do that very crude calculation, take all that profit, everybody would get about less than £20 a week extra. So if you just say it's easy, we'll just redistribute the profit, is it going to make a material difference? Because that will disappear quite quickly in inflation and other things. So we've got to be quite careful about what we say, but there must be a way of ensuring, because there are companies that manage to pay a fair wage and still make profit. There are companies that actually pay a fair wage and don't take commercial income. can still make a profit. But not a great profit. They're still in the 2%, you know. The other thing I would say is that, and this is something very recent that I've started thinking about because I've been asked to look at the cost of food waste. Actually, this came up in a talk from a group called the ECR Community Food Waste Group, where somebody just threw into the conversation, what if we just organised our whole system on the basis that you avoid waste? Not that you repurpose the waste you make, but that you actually avoid waste in the first place. Now, it actually came out of another project we did looking at online returns. What if you design your system to reduce the need for returns? You would actually make quite a fundamental change. You would actually have a much more efficient system. Because at the moment you're making quite... The other thing I didn't really get into explaining was in order to make sure you make those profits at all, is you've got to make more, have more on the shelves, move more around in the hope that you sell enough to make the profit. But you end up with waste, quite a lot of waste. And the other thing you end up with is this. Storage costs money. So ideally you want somebody else to be doing the storing. So what happens? It goes from the farmer, who can build storage, and some do. But if people want a fairly good shelf life on their goods, they're not going to want you to store it on the farm for long. So you're going to move it along to the middle supplier, who's going to move it along to the processor, who's going to move it onto the supermarket, who's going to move it onto the consumer. Sorry? Oh, sorry, I do apologise to everybody, I got carried away. So it got moved on to the consumer. Who is the best person placed to store and keep food? Is it the consumer? No. Right. But in order to keep that profit and that cash flow moving, you have to get it to them as quickly as possible. So we have a problem in the system about waste, and it's partly generated by the rest of these problems I've been talking about. So I would also say the one other thing that's missing and that's come to mind to me recently is, well, actually, who stores food? Where are our food stores? We only, as Anthony Giddens said, we only really survived as a race because we learned how to store and preserve food. And in fact, we move it, you know, do you rely on the supermarket? Well, certainly the people where I live do. The number of people in their pyjamas in the co-op at first thing in the morning. We've taken to calling it the larder. because it gets very convenient. We keep forgetting to get stuff, so we just go down to the larder. It's a very bad habit. But, you know, where's your store of food? Is it supermarkets? Is it somewhere else? Houses are now built without much storage, full stop. Is it refrigerated? So we don't really think about this. Who is actually storing the food? We have these really great initiatives, and they're all great about fresh food. But at some point, actually, you do need to have dried, frozen, pickled, preserved food to survive as people. And in countries where, or areas where you don't have a lot of fresh food, you do need to store and preserve it. So why has this dropped out of the conversation? I think it has dropped out of the conversation. Now this is where I start getting a little bit more controversial. I would take, if I could, if I had a wish, I would actually take capital markets out of food. But this is what I mean by it. You have investment, and you need investment in capital. Whatever you need something to start with, even if it's a pile of goods and not money, but you need something. And you have trading. The problem came very early on in the 17th century, where people realised that instead of waiting for that boat you had a share in to come back and give you a profit, you could sell your shares now and let the other person wait for the profit to come back. And so you start trading shares. And into the 20th century, one of the problems we have with big food and supermarkets is that there's more interested in buying and selling companies, and buying and selling shares takes the precedence over when you're financing buying and selling food. So there are also problems because these asset management companies and investment companies and hedge funds just trade on the money that's made. They're not trading on the goods. And you do get faults in there with speculation and others. So I don't really know how this will work. I'm an accountant, I just add these things up. But I would like to dig into this a bit more. I think it's the what-if question we should be asking. There's a great project by the British Academy going called The Future of the Corporation, which is very much about corporations of the future should be about having a social purpose. You should make profit for good, not profit out of the problems that people have, and certainly not profit out of the problems you make them think they've got. The key thing is, how can we make it? Could we make it so that all food companies are social enterprises or have a social purpose? Can you take out the capital trading element whilst at the same time recognising you need to provide you need to provide some capital from somewhere? I don't think this is a question that's asked often enough. But frankly, if we were being really radical about the corporation of the future, we'd say, can you take capital markets out altogether? Because capital markets nowadays are not primarily about investing, they're about trading shares and trading the company itself. And I would also go back to my very good interviewee, my best interviewee ever, and say, you need to be clear about whether you're trading or whether it's long-term supply. Are you going to have a long-term relationship, or are you you just want the money you get by buying and selling and making those small margins? You've all watched The Apprentice, you know what the games are. The problems often come about fairness is when the two are confused, and they are very much confused in the industry. You want those long-term relationships, and there are dangers in them, because quite frankly, every side in that long-term relationship will try and get one over on the other if they possibly can. Or at least make sure will fight for that bit of margin. But if you try and do both, you can't, if you try and get a price you get by haggling with somebody, but you want the service you get from long-term relationship, that costs, because it has safety and quality and packaging and all those other things I had in my fancy bar chart that I pinched from Google. So I think this is something else I would do. I would say you either trade or you have a long-term relationship. Can we get to a situation where we can make those work? Because quite often it's the middle companies, the optimal that are most optimal. They have less cost. They have sufficient income. They are the most optimal model. We seem to have either really big companies or really small companies. Both have merits, but you run into these problems. And I would also take out, if I could, because actually this is a consequence. There's more crime in the industry than we would like to think about. It's not fatal, but it's there. And it's because where you're fighting for margins or there's a chance of a premium, you've got an opportunity for crime. So if I was to say these were my principles, these are what they'd be, and I realise I'm slightly overrunning time, so I'll just do a couple more minutes. And this is the depressive. Sorry, I'm going to depress you again. The trouble is, capitalism regenerates itself. You only have to look at January to realise that you have an idea and somebody will move in and bring it into the system. There's a great book called The New Spirit of Capitalism by Boltanski and Chiapello. Basically say this. You put in that you need to look after your workers, or you build it into your model, your business model, that you're going to look after them, and they think they're looked after, and so they work longer hours for you and are more productive. It's an example of capitalism regenerating itself. And in the food industry, I think, yes, you will come up with an alternative system, and it will gradually turn into a capitalist opportunity if we're not careful. Okay, city living does distort your view. Even back in 1903, George Simmel, the philosopher, said if you live in a city, you lose not only all connection with the idea that food is produced and manufactured, you lose all sense of not just what it is or where it comes from, you lose all sense of its value. cities distort our sense of value. So I'm not going to go through all of these. I wanted to get in. I make myself. Okay. If we're going to do something, yes, do something about meat, but my reasons would be slightly different to the ones that have been talked about for the last few weeks. Partly because it's the item that's wasted the most. There's a huge amount of waste of meat. And whether you believe in eating animals or not, if you're going to kill them, then you should eat them. Nearly 570,000 tons of meat is thrown away, and I'm told by Friends of the Earth that this equates to several billion animals a year across the globe. So why are we growing it if we're going to waste it? So that's something we could start tackling straight away. It's also one of the items that's stolen the most. Meat theft is growing in supermarkets. They're now having to think about putting the same controls on meat that you have on alcohol, which is the other thing that's stolen the most. You're not really surprised, are you? But, you know, if we start thinking about it as something we should have more respect for, then maybe you think rather more about stealing. And it's also, I'm afraid to say, one of the things that's defrauded the most. You know about horse meat, I'm not going to say it again. But it's also, had you heard of meat laundering? No, and you don't want to. Okay. And the other trouble is, it is quite profligate, as we all know, because it's been on the news for the last few weeks. It is profligate in its use of nature, of water, of land, and of financial and technological resources and husbandry skills, which we undervalue. So again, if people are growing meat, they should be rewarded for the actual management, return to management, their skill, but often they're not. Now, I'm being quite bold in this. I'm not giving you the twos and fours and the other arguments and the counter-arguments because there's not time. But there are these fundamental things going on. And I have this suspicion that less would be more in the meat industry. If we did less, actually, people wouldn't necessarily earn less. Less would be more. But there would be unintended consequences. And plant alternatives have unintended consequences as well, because we could end up living just on factory-produced food, and I'm not sure that's a good alternative either. Okay, so having hopefully given you some interesting things to think about, and even better, hopefully starting a discussion going on, and please argue with me or bring up points. Corinne did ask me to finish by saying, who are some of the women that have influenced me in my thinking? So, there are so many women across the world who are creating alternative food systems, running food companies. I was quite interested in my research for this. I discovered that Whitbread, the brewery, come Premier Inn people, actually their board is 50-50, men and women. They're one of the very few. But they aren't my inspiration. Food Tank is run by, or set up by a woman, whose name I do apologise to her, but I've just forgotten. But they give 25 influential women in food and agriculture, and I would look at that because it's people from all over the globe who've set up different types of enterprise. That's good. And I also saw this film while I was in Canada recently, and it's women like this lady Maxima, who's quite inspirational. She's actually a farmer, but she's been fighting a mining corporation who tried to force her off her land, which she had bought for her own. And she was leading a fight, but the whole region was leading the fight to preserve their water and other resources from the mining company, which this particular mining company did have quite bad practices. So there are these very inspirational women. When we come into redesigning the systems, this is an interesting company I've come across recently, run by a woman called Cher Merriweather in Canada. And they've actually come up with a way of looking at the companies in the middle of the food supply chain, using a model and taking out huge amounts of waste. I'd advise going to their website and looking at their free case studies, because they show you how there's actually quite a lot of cost in the middle of the system, doesn't need to be there. So actually, and I've spoken to her while I was there briefly, and this is it's okay working with the system as it is, but looking at it in a different way. Saying, where can we actually take out the cost? Not just that we need to accept it. And finally, two more. There's a book by Molly Scott Cato, who was an MEP up to the end of this week. And she's written a very interesting book about what it really means to have a bioregional economy, what it local really means. And she's good. And the last one, the book that's probably been most influential to me, and I've had the privilege of meeting Julie Gutman as well, who wrote it, is called Weighing In. And it's about essentially how capitalism renews itself in the food industry and how we can take it out. It was a really good read about food systems in there. And she links it a lot more into nutrition and other models as well. Again, if you get the chance to read that or hear her speak, I would say they were people that had influenced me. So, thank you very much for listening, and I hope you've got one or two comments or questions. The warning is if you don't, I'll just keep on talking.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That's absolutely fascinating. I was completely gripped. I should say that said at the beginning, my name is Corinna Hawkes, by the way. I'm Director of the Centre for Food Policy. So thank you so much, Lisa. Absolutely fascinating. Questions and comments, reflections. What did it make you think? What did it make you think about? What questions have you got for Lisa while she's standing in front of you? A great privilege. I've got 3 points here. So 1, 2, and 3.
I've noticed you. This Tony as well. Okay.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting. I have 2 questions, just things that I'm curious to know your opinion on. The first one, just about farmers' markets. I don't know the specifics, but I feel like there's some modelling to suggest that can improve profitability for farmers and help shorten that chain. So my first question is that something you think can help? And the second question is, do you think food is too cheap? Is that a central problem that actually we should be talking about?
It's funny, when I prepared for this talk, I said to people, I've got to prepare for the question about is food too cheap? But thank you. I'll answer the farmers' market one first. It can help farmers and producers, but possibly not in the way people expect, because you don't necessarily make a lot of money on the day of the farmers' market. What it does, and I'll give you the example I was given in Washington DC. Somebody said that it cost them money, essentially, to do the farmers' market on the day, but actually they had far more people signing up and coming to their business afterwards. So in the long term, yes, it did help grow the business. I think by itself is like all markets. It depends on the footfall and who comes through. What it does give you is visibility, and what it may give you is more regular customers. So the benefit of this isn't necessarily just in cash terms. The benefit is in marketing and being known and actually building up a customer base. Because, again, it's a bit like the supermarkets. You build up a customer base that covers your overheads and you can afford to do other things. It's not much different to any other small business. So it does help, and it gives you an outlet. So there are other benefits, of course, in that you have shorter supply chains. But again, it's still quite costly. You've got to give up a day. You've got to go to the market, or you've got to pay somebody else to be at the market. It's not there are costs attached to it as well as benefits, but it seems to be the main benefit is that it extends your customer base for later sales. There's one view on it. With the cheap food, it's very difficult to answer because not all food is priced in the same way. And I think there is quite a lot of scope. There is a lot of cost in the middle that could be taken out, that would go some way to reducing cost. Again, if we did the sum about, well, why don't they give the profits and reduce the price of food? Well, across a population of 65 million, we'd all benefit by about $3.35 in a year off our shopping bills. So, you know, for anyone, that's a very crude calculation, by the way. So, some food is too cheap, and it's not necessarily the price. I think it's the value. And so I'm going to go back to my meat example. We don't put a good value on meat. I think some meat is too cheap. I'm a bit coloured by the fact I did a consultancy project for an assurance for a certification body, which meant I spent the summer going around abattoirs. But you just get the industrial quantities of it. We just don't value it as a product. We should value it a bit more, like good alcohol or something else. And I'm not a meat eater, but this is a view. I know all the arguments for not having meat at all. But I think if you're going to have some foods are undervalued. So it's not the same as the price, but they are undervalued. And we should look at them in a different way. Similarly, some things are overvalued, like bottled water. And the problem with that is you need to start asking where they're getting that water from and look at some of the campaigns that are going on. I haven't bought bottled water since I came back from Canada in December, having seen what a particular company was doing in the region that I was in, because they've basically been taking water without permission, and it's affected the local community quite significantly, let alone the plastic. So, sorry, I'd rather answer that at length. Is that okay? Thank you.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. I was involved in setting up what's called the Grocery Code Adjudicator.
Oh, yes.
And I wanted to ask you to say something about that. So the Groceries Code Adjudicator, for those that don't know it, is a behavioural regulator. So when our Competition Commission looked at our supermarkets, it did not break them up by floor space, which I would be in favour of. It decided that, on balance, the long-term consumer detriment was there, and therefore it was worth setting up a regulator to stop unilateral impositions of a supermarket onto its suppliers, but it's only the largest 13. I think that there's a need to stop these unilateral requests for basically donations. We can call it whatever we want, but basically it's give me money or else, that goes throughout the supply chain. And I think there's a need to extend the remit of the Grocery Code Adjudicator much bigger and more widely. But I'd be very interested in knowing if you'd seen any impact, or if anyone said it did protect them around those really tiny, tiny margins. Because effectively that's all we're playing with, even with that regulator and what it was set up to achieve.
Yeah. Right, I have spoken with the Grocery Code Adjudicator briefly. So I've had that opportunity, but only on one occasion. But I do know, but just looking at it set up, the problem is it's not there to protect suppliers. As such, they can't argue on individual cases. It's the more general system that they're looking at. So, no, I haven't had anybody come to me and say, yes, I've done better because of it. But there is a general feeling, I think, that it has been worthwhile, because if nothing else, it did provide a mechanism for looking at the coercive nature of some of the suppliers' agreements and commercial income. And I think there has been a change in that. Even if I just took it from reading the annual reports of some of these companies, they're now disclosing more, and they're being more honest about what they're disclosing. And in one case, they have stated quite clearly that they have reduced the number of things that they ask for money on down to 3. And allegedly, in an article, this particular company used to have 24 categories that they could ask on. Now, I'm not quite sure whether bonuses and penalties come in, for late delivery and things like that. But I think there has been a general benefit in that people feel that at least there's someone they can go to complain to, and the fact that there has been some change in behaviour because it's come to light. I think it's very valuable, but it's making, again, it's something that's going under the radar, if we take the term of this talk. And it's quite a difficult one to analyse just exactly what that benefit is at the moment, but it's certainly, I think there have been changes. I've not been able to go back and ask people that I've interviewed before about whether it's got any better or any worse. That's my answer. Yes. Yes.
What you said. She is set up to listen to individual complaints. And if she has said that she...
Oh, no. She is set up. Sorry, that wasn't what I was getting at.
Yeah.
She can listen to individual complaints. She can't necessarily I'm not sure the extent to which the grocery code adjudicator can act as an adjudicator for... She can investigate the complaints. She can't necessarily settle a case between a single person.
Yes.
That's what I meant.
Yeah.
Okay. But thank you. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for a lovely talk. I wanted to ask about the variance in the system. So at a global level, at different geographies, are there systems where the margins are bigger? And then also in the UK system, say in the US, has online grocery changed that, or is that different in the way they operate? And then thirdly, what happened with the introduction of fair trade? And is that such a small part of the market, or has that changed things? And how does it operate within it? So that's quite a lot of points.
That's quite three. Sorry, what was the first one?
The first one was about the geography.
Oh, right, geography,
So different, are there less of systems with bigger margins and less fraud and less problems?
It is a global system. And if you look at the supermarkets in the developed countries, it's more or less the same pattern, it's the same practices. And they're also beginning to appear in developing countries as well. I guess where the difference is in partly in ownership and partly where you have less concentration. And of course I'm now going to go completely blank as to which particular geography has less concentration, but the biggest feature over the last 30 years has been this very much concentration of the industry into a very few slaughterhouses, into a very few distributors, into a very few grower packers, and into a very few supermarkets. So I'd say the main difference would be where you have less concentration. So, UK it's about 80% of sales go through 4 different supermarkets. In Australia, about 80% go through 2. So you get the same problems. I haven't done the maths to be able to answer the rest of your question, sorry. The second question was about... Yeah, I haven't looked at that, but I have a colleague here and I who'd looked at the online sales of general merchandise. Basically, it's added an awful lot of cost into the system. And I think the myth is that if you go online, it must be cheaper to run. And it's really not cheap to run an online system. You've also... Has it changed a lot? I think it's increased sales, but you've not necessarily made any more profit. I think that would be my summing up, but I would have to look a bit more. It's actually very difficult to extract those. It's difficult enough to extract out what's food and what's something else from these sets of accounts unless you're inside. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think it does. That's more to do with things about extending your customer base and covering your initial investment, I would think, as well. And sorry, there was a third question. It's marginal. Yeah. Dodd. Yeah. It's still an issue. I think that's generally accepted is it has improved the livelihoods of some, but it's still marginal. And it hasn't had it's not necessarily had a great impact. Again, I'm sorry, I don't have those figures to hand, but I think the short answer is it's had a beneficial effect, but probably not as much as people would have hoped. There's still, I know I've read at least one article where they said, well, actually, you call it fair trade, it's still not giving a livelihood to some companies or families.
Okay, questions?
Oh, goodness.
Okay, we'll start here, and then listen to questions here, and have a question at the front. I think if we take, because time's running on, if we can take...
Maybe one question?
Should we take all of the questions?
Oh, yes, let me get a pen.
So, Barbara, please go ahead. You can say who you are first, that would be great.
Yes. Thank you. Barbara Hassel from the Royal Vet College, working in animal health. And first one is a quick comment. I think I would also add milk to the meat. I think very similar dynamics there.
Yes.
But my question is about thinking about the 120 billion of revenue that you mentioned, and saying that most of it is being eaten up by the variable and fixed costs, and you mentioned very massive proportions of overheads. If we expand into the system, are there stakeholders in the system or companies in the system that have really decent profit margins or gross margins? So technology, transportation, security, all of that somewhere, the money needs to go, or not?
Yeah, well, it's not the food companies that have got the good margins. Yeah. It's the support companies. The technology. I haven't got recent figures to hand, but the technology companies probably, and I'm just taking a guess at agrochemicals, those types of supply. The agri-business side of it. That's a very good question, though. I don't want to say a lot more because although I'm an accountant, I can't keep that many numbers in my head, and I would have to go away and double check. But if you want to email me, I can give you a better answer.
I'm Tony Allen from King's College. Lisa, that was wonderful. You've filled in a whole lot of gaps. I tend to assume that since the middle of the food supply chain, farming, production, trading, processing, manufacturing, and retailing, that's a market. And at the other end, we've got the consumers, us. And so we've got three parts. Now, you've made it seem, as we all do, because the media and everyone thinks, well, the food system is a market. Yes, it is, but it's three different sorts of market.
Yes.
It's a massively failed market at the beginning, and you shouldn't ever put it on the same slide as the other stuff. Because 30% is what the cap is, as you've pointed out. If you go to Norway or Switzerland, where they really do it properly, it's 75% and 60%. So this is a government public enterprise, and it's not a market. And the accountants aren't in there at all doing anything useful. The accountants do something seemingly quite useful, which you understand better than anyone in the room, in the middle. It's not a spectacularly successful market, but it is. People pay taxes, make profits, not much, 1% or 2%. So it's completely different from what we've just been talking about. And then the consumers in the United States, 76 billion a year is on food stamps. So we have in the background, we haven't got a market, we've got a sort of market, we've got a failed market, and the funny thing at the end, the consumers, well, again, governments have a deal with their people. They've got to provide underpriced food for the underpaid. So my question, I got thousands of questions.
Yes, yes, we could
My
go on
question is,
quite a long time, yes.
What about the failed market?
Okay, and just to be clear, which bit are you saying is the failed market? I think production. The production and the farming is the failed market. Yeah. Yes.
The failed market.
Yes. Okay, but it's a failed market, but it's not a completely separate market to the others. It has these dependencies and links between them and between consumers. So maybe it comes back to the question, maybe the question we should be asking is, should it be a market, or should it be a different sort of market? Has it got caught up?
No asset managers in there.
It's got no asset managers. No, it hasn't. It's got owner managers in there. And the question is, now some of those owner managed companies are actually very stable, very good. They're not all failed in that sense. The other question is, though, the asset managers, but then you've got another set of companies which still have owner management to some extent. So I think that's actually a really difficult question to answer. How do we deal with it with the market, or do we change our idea of what a market is completely? You know, so I think the radical question here is really, what sort of market should it be, or should it be something that's not a market? And if it's not a market, how do we start talking about it? Should it be, again, it comes down to then questions of public support, or is it just a whole network of those types of community farms where farms are supporting a small group of regional people? But then do you get inequalities because obviously some regions are more fertile than others? So I think that's almost an impossible question to answer at this stage. Do you have an answer? Yeah, I know we do. Okay, I'll phrase that another way. I think that's almost an impossible question to answer in 5 minutes. And I think I will have to opt out at this stage, because I think I think you've asked the right question, and I know we've discussed this in the past as well, and about the fact that actually it fails the environment because it's not exploited. That's not true. It depends on which accountants you're talking about, because there is this whole movement about how you account for sustainability, and how you have accounting that does. The fancy term at the moment is integrated accounting. There are actually quite a lot of accountants, and there's far more accounting academics interested in social and environmental accounting. Their problem is they don't think about the food industry, which has the biggest impact on the environment and sometimes the social side. So I would say there are accountants thinking about it. Some of the big accounting firms, yeah, that's another question. And also, as we've discussed in the past, it's actually very difficult to put up a set of accounts to address some of these problems. It's possibly outside classical accounting techniques, or the or I should say more clearly, the politics of accounting. But unless I give my lecture now on the politics of accounting, we're going to run into another issue. That's maybe a lecture for another day.